No, I'm not gonna sit in the front seat or keep sitting in this seat. Yeah, but I got
Sit down there, right there by Ron.
yeah. It's you probably run me off. I don't want to get somebody cheering. That's the worst thing you can do. I say I don't get. I've heard stories about downtown.
Only one I know is Ruby.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. I do take that back. My memory's not very good.
You let them know you're in my spot. Wave at me. He's not going to do it. We'll go back there.
He got my feet. I'm gonna have to stand up.
This is a public service announcement. Who's driving the red F-150 out there?
I got one, but it may be period.
It's your horns are honking. I don't know. Tana says your horns honking. If you're driving a red F-150,
Which one is it?
and probably it's not honking anymore because the battery's dead. So.
I didn't see any order on that.
No, that was a public service announcement. See, that doesn't count.
By the way, good evening. Ray wouldn't say good evening before he got started, but as he went by, he came. You don't say good evening for public service announcements. It's good to see you tonight. We're glad that you're here. He handed me the announcements as he went by, and he said, "It's yours." So, let me give you just a little bit of an update on some of the things that we know concerning the things that you need to know. First of all, keep in mind that our plan is that we were going to be going back to a normal Sunday schedule. Not this coming Sunday, but the first Sunday in June, June the 5th. So that means on that day, we will have our Bible classes at 9:30. Then we'll go back into our worship service here in the auditorium at 10:30. And then we're going to go into our 5 o'clock worship service. So normal Sunday evening, normal Sunday schedule beginning June 5th. So make your plans for that. Our prayer list includes Olita Seeley. She is continuing her rehab in Tahoka. Also, Kay McKinney, the wife of Frankie McKinney, with malignant breast cancer. Continue to keep Bill Morrison, son-in-law of Larry Davis, in your prayers. Donna Earhart, the sister-in-law of Mary Earhart. Also, Raymond Lambert, Rosa Demas, Jack Kelly. Michelle is here tonight. She's doing well, so we're glad for that. Also, keep in your prayers Peggy Barron and Hattie Browning. Of course, we have several that remain on our prayer list. They've been there for several weeks, a couple of months maybe. So keep all of them in your prayers. I know they would appreciate that. Again, we are glad you're here. This coming Sunday, I'll go back and I'll backtrack this week. This coming Sunday, we will have our 10:30 worship service here in the auditorium. And That service again will be live streamed for those that are still not comfortable getting out. So we're ready to get into our worship this evening and then our Bible class. Monty, I think, is leading singing, so let's enjoy time together.
Our first song tonight is 469. 469. I'm glad to be here. I hope you are too. I'm hanging out with a good crowd tonight. Good crowd. I have hung out with not 60, but a long time ago. That's on the area. Okay. 469. Been a long time. 469. Encamped along the hills of light, you dressed in soldiers ride, and press the battle ere the night shall bear the glowing skies. Against the foe and bells below, let all our strength be hurled. Faith of victory we know, that overcomes the world. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. His banner over us is love, our sword, the word of God. We tread the road the saints above, with shouts of triumph trod. By faith they like a whirlwind spread, step over every field. The faith by which they conquer death is still our shining shield. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. To him that overcomes the foe, by raiment shall he give. Before the angels he shall know his name confessed in heaven. Then onward from the hills of light, our hearts with love of flame will vanquish all the hosts of night, in Jesus' conquering name. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. 480. 480 is our next song. At the conclusion of this song, we'll have our minds ready to prayer. 480. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Heir of salvation, purchased of God, born of His Spirit, washed in His blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, all is at rest. I in my Savior am happy and blessed, watching and waiting, looking above, filled with my goodness, lost in His love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all
all the day long. Holy Father in heaven, we come before you this time, asking you to hear our prayer, Father. Father, we know that we of ourselves do not deserve being heard by you, Holy Father. But we ask that you hear us, for we come by the authority of and through Jesus the Christ, the one who is King of kings and Lord of lords and high priest. We pray, Father, that you cause your Spirit that dwells within us to help us to pray. Help us, Father, as we study your word tonight. Open our hearts and our minds and help us, Father, to truly understand the things that you want us to do. Help us, Father, that your Spirit might provoke us to desire to know your will and to do it. Father, we have many of our number that are sick and have ailments and problems, and we know this plague is going across our country and our world. We pray, Father, that you cause the things that are done to heal us, Father, and help this experience, Father, cause each of us to recognize that all things depend upon you and your help. Help us, Father, we might not look to the things of the world to provide us with our need, but that we might look to you, Father. Father, this time our country is dry, and we need the rain so we might plant the crops. We pray, Father, if it be your will, that you send the weather, the right weather, to come and wash in our lands. Bless our crops and bless us, Father, that we might produce abundantly. And as your servants, your stewards of these things you've given to us, Father, help us to use them to bring honor and glory to your most high and holy name, most high and holy name of Jesus Christ. Father, we're mindful of our sin. We're mindful, Father, of how we have failed to achieve the purposes and goals that you have for us. Open our eyes and help us to see these things, Father, and help us that we might desire that your will be done, not ours. And that is our prayer, Father, that we come before you and ask for things. We ask that you hear our prayer, but we ask that you grant those things that are according to your will, your good and perfect and holy will. For it is by the authority of Jesus Christ that we come, the one who's King of kings and Lord of lords. But again, Father, we pray and say, not our will, but your will be done.
If you will, please turn to 514. This will be our song before our lesson tonight. 514. Redeemed now I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed through his infinite mercy, his child and forever I am. Redeemed, 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 redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, 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 his child and forever I am. Redeemed and so happy in Jesus, no language my rapture can tell. I know that the light of his presence with me does continually dwell. Redeemed, 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 redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Redeemed, 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 his child and forever I am. I know I shall see in his beauty, the King in his law I delight, who lovingly guardeth my footsteps, and giveth me songs in the night. Redeemed, 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 redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Redeemed, 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 his child and forever I am.
evening again. We're glad that you're here. Look forward to our study this evening and look at some things that I hope will be helpful to us. We are studying the book of Romans in our class on Wednesday night. This is going to be a short-lived time. We're going to be studying the book of Romans on Wednesday night because beginning in June on Wednesday night, we're going to begin our speaker series with the different members of the congregation, different men, doing the teaching. So through the summer, we're going to take a little bit of a hiatus away from the book of Romans, and then we'll let our men teach during the summer. So hopefully you're looking forward to that. It's always a really good time, a time when I think everybody enjoys listening to what our men have to say. They always do a really good job. Over the last couple of weeks, we have been looking at the first few verses in the letter to the Romans. Beginning in chapter 1, we've looked down through about verse 17. And so tonight, I want us to pick up in chapter 1 and verse 18. The first 17 verses of this letter are really what we have identified as introductory material, where Paul identifies himself as the writer. He identifies the Roman church as his recipients of the letter. He tells us a little bit about what his goals are through the story of the book of Romans. And then he talked about the thesis statement that I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to all those who believe, in the Jew first, as well as to the Greek. And then we talked last week about verse 17. Beginning in verse 18, and going through chapter 3 and verse 20, we have pictured what in our outline that we talked about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the doctrine of sin. So we want to begin at verse 18 and talk about that. And the first part of this, in the rest of chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, Paul is going to be speaking to, and he's going to be dealing with the Gentiles and their sinful state. Now, he's going to get into the sinful state of the Jews over in chapter 2, but the rest of chapter 1, he's going to be focusing primarily on the Gentiles. And then again, like I said, in chapter 2 and going through the first part of chapter 3, the Jewish state of sin. And I thought we would begin by thinking about this. You know, a lot of times when we teach people, I think we oftentimes start in teaching them with what they need to do, telling them what they need to do in order to be right with God. And then we wonder and scratch our heads, why don't they do it? Well, I think what we're guilty of doing sometimes is, and it's real easy for us to do it, and that is we start with where we want people to be, rather than starting with them where they are. And we'll explain that a little bit more as we go through the lesson this evening. But I think it's a real common thing when we get the opportunity to sit down and teach somebody the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have sometimes foremost in our minds how important it is that we get through to them exactly what it is that God wants them to do. And we want to get to that just as quickly as possible. And so we begin by telling them what they need to do and what we want them to do, rather than identifying for them where they are and why they need to do what God says they need to do. So maybe I could illustrate that this way. I don't know if you've ever tried to sell anything. I tried one time and I was unsuccessful. But let's just suppose that all of us are salesmen and we've got a product that we're trying to sell to somebody. Maybe we are a salesman in a department store, or maybe we are a door-to-door salesman. It doesn't really matter what kind of salesman that you are. But have you ever tried to sell somebody on something, trying to sell them the beauty of the product that you had to offer to them without first trying to sell them on the fact that they need the product? You know, I can remember, and I guess they still have door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesmen, I don't know. But I can remember vacuum cleaner salesmen coming and knocking on our door and wanting to demonstrate for us their vacuum cleaner. And so if they were given the opportunity to come into your home, what they would do is they would begin to assemble their vacuum cleaner that they have been carrying in pieces. And then they would want to know what kind of vacuum cleaner you have. And in your mind, you've got a really good vacuum cleaner. In your mind, you are determined that it's doing a great job. And I'll sit here and I'll bear with you through your sales pitch to me, but there's not really anything that I think that you're going to be able to tell me that is going to convince me that I need your product. But a really good vacuum cleaner salesman is one who is going to come into your home and do his very best to convince you that in spite of what we might think, you really need my product. And so what's he going to do? He's going to come in and he's going to say, okay, here's your vacuum cleaner. I want you to vacuum an area of your rug with your vacuum cleaner. And so you get over there and you start vacuuming, and he says, I want you to vacuum it really good. And so you've got a small area that you're vacuuming, and you vacuum for about 4 or 5 minutes longer than you would ever vacuum in a cleaning effort. And he says, okay, now do you think you've got your carpet clean? And you say, yes, I believe I do. So he'll take out his vacuum cleaner that, first of all, he is convinced is the best vacuum cleaner on the planet. And he's going to put something in that receptacle that all of the dust that he's expecting to get is going to collect on, maybe a piece of white cloth or something. And he's going to go over the very same spot that you have vacuumed, and he's only going to go over it 2 or 3 times. And when he is done, he's going to take that little piece of cloth out, and he's going to say, let me show you what my vacuum cleaner got that yours didn't. And you look on there and you think, wow, I didn't know my house was that dirty. Or whatever you think. He's trying to convince you, you need that product. And so, the first thing that the first purpose that he has is that he's going to try to convince you why you need it. And then he's going to tell you how you can have it. How you can have it gets to be the expensive part. The costing thing for him to do your carpet or what he'd done. But a lot of times, whenever you're trying to sell somebody something, if you went into if that salesman came in, or if you went into somebody else's house and you got this vacuum cleaner and you try to tell them this is what you need without convincing them why they need it, you're probably going to get pushed out the door and you're going to leave that house without having made a sale. Because the first thing you've got to do is don't tell them you need this vacuum cleaner. Show them why you need it. And so that's what you want to do. The real salesman is the one who can convince you that you just got to have this product. And let me share with you how you can have it. Doesn't cost but $3,500 or whatever. But he said, oh, you can get it cheap. On a monthly basis, you can get it. Well, a lot of times, whenever we're trying to convince people their need for truth and to obey the gospel, we begin with the response of a man by telling him, let me go back and say that, start that over. Say it a different way. The first thing we need to do is go in and sit down with somebody and help them to understand their spiritual condition. If I can help somebody to know their spiritual condition, if their spiritual condition is one that is a lost condition, now then I've got something to go on and help them to understand why they need the gospel. And so a lot of times what we try to do is we try to meet people's needs without them even knowing they need it. We've got to help them to know why they need it. And so when Paul begins the writing to the church in Rome, I think we can learn something from his letter that the first thing that a person needs to know is that they're sinners. And before they can ever get to a good condition and relationship with God, first of all, they've got to understand the fact of their sinful state. The fact that that person is condemned and in need of what Jesus can offer them. And so beginning in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18, the Apostle Paul begins by showing the Gentile people in the city of Rome that they're sinners. He's going to begin by telling them what their situation is. And he deals with that. And you could call this the inexcusableness of man. The man without the written word is inexcusable simply because he's a sinner. Simply because he is in a state that has separated him from God. And without Jesus, he's lost. Well, the first thing we need to know whenever we're talking to people about that is, I think we need to help them to understand that it's, well, first of all, maybe we need to understand as members of the body of Christ that we are not to blame for the lost condition of people. I think sometimes maybe we've had that kind of beat into our thinking that because we have not preached the gospel, it is our fault that people, and we are blamed that people are lost. When in reality, it's kind of getting the cart before the horse, just to a bit of degree. Think about this. Why is man lost? If a person is going to be lost in eternity, why are they going to be lost? We could go around and ask several different responses to that. But let me suggest to you that some people might say that people are lost because they've not obeyed the gospel of Christ. Is that a fair statement? Is that a true statement? Possibly. But that's not all of it. You see, the reason why people are lost is because they're sinners. That's the reason people are lost. They're lost because they're sinners. And so those people who have never heard the gospel of Christ, if in eternity they are lost, it's not because they didn't hear the gospel, not because we didn't take the gospel to them, not because they didn't have the opportunity to hear the gospel preached. It's because they're sinners. It doesn't matter whether they're in Lamesa, Texas, or the jungles of Africa, or wherever they might be. They're lost because they're sinners. What they need to know is they are sinners. And so Paul is writing to these people in Rome, and he's wanting them to know that without the gospel, you are sinners, and that the fact that you are sinners puts you in a relationship outside of God. We may be to blame for somebody not hearing the gospel. That doesn't mean we are to blame for their sinfulness. So, and God is not to blame for that. And so in this section of the book of Romans, in chapter 1, Paul is going to show the man in sin is to blame. And that man to whom God has given no record is inexcusable simply because he's in sin. Not because he's never heard the gospel, not because he's never obeyed the gospel, not because he heard it and dismissed it, but rather because he's a sinner. So, the first thing that Paul wants these brethren to know is the wrath of God. Look at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. There are going to be several things in this passage that are revealed to these Gentiles about their sinful condition. And how's it going to be revealed? Well, it's going to be revealed in judgment. I mean, they did this wickedness, and the nation became exceedingly wicked because of things that they've been involved in. And God rained judgment down upon them. They learned the wrath of God. Go all the way back to the Old Testament, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And surely those people in Sodom and Gomorrah learned something about the wrath of God when those cities were destroyed. When the Assyrian power and all its height of power was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, those people learned something about the wrath of God. And so the wrath of God is seen. It's seen in the flood of Noah's day. It's seen in the fires of Sodom. It will be seen in judgment. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and all unrighteousness. And if you look around the world today, and you see what's going on in our world and in our society, the natural tendency of everything that is living in this world is when something becomes corrupt, it dies. Whatever it might be. And that reveals something to us of the wrath of God, that when a thing becomes corrupt, it dies. That's the nature of God. That's the wrath of God. And so in verses 19 and 20, listen to Paul. Because what may be known of God was manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So here's a question. How is God revealed to you? Think about that for a minute. How is God revealed to you and me? How do we know God? Well, again, we could go around the room, we could get several different answers to that. Paul says here that God was made known to them by what God has shown to them. And he talks about the creation. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. That's interesting. That which is invisible can be clearly seen through God's creation. How do we know God? Look around. See the different aspects of God's creation and in His nature. And yet there's more than that. Verse 19 talks about something of some kind of an innate knowledge of who God is. He says, God is manifest, that is made known in them. God, there's just something in man that helps us to know that God is real, and that God is alive, and that God really does care. And it's been revealed to us. It's been revealed to us through the things that we see, the things that we understand, His eternal power and His Godhead. We're made to know who God is. And so, as Paul describes this, he begins by talking about the fact that God can be known. And that this God, whose wrath we have seen in many different ways, will be incurred by those who are sinners. Verse 21, because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were they thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Now, that's an interesting thought that is described here. And he's going to go on and he's going to talk about those who profess to be wise and those that become, when they profess to be wise, they become fools. They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like a corruptible man, four-footed beasts, and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. In other words, it's as though Paul is saying, one of the things with man is, you need to understand, man has been made in the image of God. But what man does oftentimes is he tries to make God in his image. We try to make God look like us. We try to make God appear like us. And so there's something that is described in there in idolatry. They changed the incorruptible God into an image made like a corruptible man. God's not like you and me. I think we know that. We understand that. Sometimes we try to personalize God just a little bit, don't we? I think it's easier for us to identify with the God when we think about a God with hands and a face. The Bible talks about the face of God. Whenever Jesus came and He walked on the face of this earth, Jesus took upon Himself the form of man. He had a body, and in so doing, He gave us a little bit of an idea about God. Even though we know that God is spiritual, He doesn't have flesh and blood. He has no bones, things like that. But it's easier for us sometimes to identify with God when we can kind of put some features to Him that we're familiar with. Because we can't identify with the spirit being, really. Now, we know He's spiritual, but still at the same time, we try to personalize Him just a little bit. And Paul says the problem with that is that we begin to cause God, this incorruptible God, to be made more like a corruptible man. And He's not. He's nothing like us. And those who profess themselves to be wise, oh, how foolish that is. The Bible says that our wisdom is in Jesus. Paul says in 1 Corinthians. And if our wisdom is in Jesus, then we may be wise, but our wisdom is not our own, it's through Jesus. And so if we profess ourselves to be wise, he says, we become fools. We change the glory of God. Therefore, Verse 24 says, God gave them up. Verse 26 says, God gave them up. Verse 28 says, God gave them over to a debased mind. The first thing that comes into my mind is, can you just imagine what it must be like for God to give you up? For God to get to a point to where He just kind of pushes you out of the way and says you're no longer important to Him. Now we know God doesn't do that. But there comes a time in the lives of some people who become so reprobate, I guess, or they become so defiant that God determines these people are never going to follow me, so I'll give them up. Paul talks about that God gave them up. 3 times he mentions that in this letter. And that's an unsettling thought, to think that there might be somebody that God would give up. You remember the Bible talks about if you're trying to teach somebody and they're just so stubborn, or they're so defiant, or they're just so unwilling to obey the gospel, there comes a time when you shake the dust from your feet and you move on to somebody else. Don't waste your time with somebody who is determined, I'm not going to obey the gospel. So find somebody that you can teach and somebody that will listen. Maybe that's some of what Paul is talking about here in reference to God. But notice who it is that he gave up on. He gave them up to uncleanness, and in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. And they exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So that first group of people that Paul says that God gave up were people who were so determined that they were going to live their lives in uncleanness. They were going to live their lives turning away from God and worshiping the creature. Worshiping, there's some cultures that worship cows or whatever. Some of you cow people wonder, why would you ever worship a cow? But he talks about those who worship the creature rather than the Creator. What's the reason for that? Well, one of the reasons may be that they've changed the image of God from an incorruptible being to a corruptible man. And then he says in verse 26, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions. I want you to notice something. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And you read that, and you listen to what Paul is saying, and it makes me wonder, how in the world can there be people in our world today, and it's a growing number of people, who will tell you that the homosexual lifestyle is acceptable and that there is nothing in Scripture that talks against it. But if that's not what this verse is talking about, then please tell me what it's meaning. It talks about people who exchange the natural use for that which is against nature. And it talks about those who lust for one another, women lusting for women, and men lusting for men, men committing with men that which is shameful. And yet we're living in a day and time when you can hardly go anywhere, listen to anything, or see on the news anything about anything at all. And the homosexual lifestyle is being promoted, it's being encouraged, it's being appreciated. But nothing in Scripture says anything against it. This verse says, God will give those people up. If they are determined to be involved in that kind of relationship, the Bible says that they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. Verse 28. And yes, the Bible does speak out against that gay and lesbian lifestyle. And if the Bible speaks out against it, and God says it should not be done, then where in the world do we get this idea that it is just something that people by nature are? We can spend a lot of time talking about that, and there may come a time, unfortunately, there may come a time, the threat is very real out there. There may come a time when teaching and preaching against the homosexual lifestyle will be like for a group of people and protest their homosexual lifestyle and say that it's wrong, say it's ungodly or whatever, could actually be fined or even placed in jail because you have done something that you're not allowed to do. But to the people whom Paul is writing in the city of Rome, these people are Christians. But he's talking to them, helping them to understand that there have been some things in their lifestyle that are ungodly and that are sinful. And God will give you up. And then he'll go on and say, he'll talk in verse 28 about those whom God has given over to a debased mind to do those things which are fitting. And then he will identify some, I don't remember exactly how many, but some 24, 25, 26 different sexual activities that in the eyes of God are wrong. We're not going to take the time to identify what all of those are. Most of them we're well acquainted with as we go through and listen to what Paul says. He talks about all unrighteousness and wickedness and maliciousness and envy and murder, evil-mindedness, whisperers. Let's talk a moment about whisperers. In the modern English, that word whisperer really refers to a gossiper. One who is a gossip. The Proverbs letter, the book of Proverbs, has a lot to say about the whisperer or about the gossip. The Proverbs writer will say that a whisperer separates chief friends. He'll say a whisperer stirs up contention. And somebody said one time, most arguments, I don't know if this is exactly right, but somebody said most arguments are started by gossip. I don't know if that's really right. There may be that some are, maybe that a lot are. Now let's talk about this. You know, you can whisper and you can tell the truth. But you don't have to always say anything, you know. Sometimes we're better off not saying anything, you know. That's hard for me sometimes. It's easy just to kind of get on a roll and start saying things. All of a sudden you said things you shouldn't have said. But you don't always have to say everything you know. It's okay to be silent. Have you ever been in a room when there's nothing but silence? And you can cut the tension with a knife. because we don't like it when there's nothing being said. Well, things don't always have to be spoken. There doesn't always have to be words that are being said. Sometimes silence is among the best things that we can be involved in. Often the loving thing is to be silent. So Paul's going to talk about whisperers. Just because you know something bad about a person doesn't necessarily mean you need to go tell it. Just because you think you've heard something bad about somebody doesn't necessarily mean that you have to build a case against that person simply because you heard it. So he's going to talk about whisperers. A little bit later on, he's going to talk about, well, the next verse, in verse 30, he's going to talk about backbiters. Those maybe who have a bad attitude toward authority. They don't agree with someone in authority, and so they go around doing, saying whatever they might say. Then he talks about being disobedient to parents. We don't have a lot of kids in here. Those of you that are going to listen to this. Disobedient to parents. We need to teach our children how important it is that they be obedient to their parents. Maybe parents need to be taught that same thing. Well, I can remember some times when I grew up in a very strict household as far as my parents were concerned. Whenever my dad said something, you better be ready to do exactly what he said. Whenever my mother said this is the way it's going to be, you better know that's the way it's going to be. I can remember some times whenever I wanted to do something, but I was told, no, you can't do that. I can remember one specific time, there was a gospel meeting going on in town, and on Tuesday night, there was a really important basketball game. The Plainview Bulldogs were playing there in town that night. And I just thought, man, I've got to go. They can't win this game without me. At least I guess that's what I thought. My mother said, no, you're not going. You're going to the meeting. I didn't like it, but I went. I don't have any idea whether I listened to what was being spoken by the preacher, but this idea of being disobedient to parents is something that we see rampant in our world today. We can go on, we can talk about some other things that are described there, but all of these things, the Apostle Paul says these are things that as Christians we don't involve ourselves in because they're sinful. And so when he talks about them, there may well have been some who he was writing to, who would read those things and they would think in their mind, that kind of describes me. And I'm a sinner. You see, he needed them to know they were sinners. He's not going to talk about salvation until he gets over into chapter 3, toward the end of chapter 3. But before he talks about salvation, he wants them to know their need to be saved. Now he's writing to Christians. They've already obeyed the gospel. Go over to chapter 6 and you know that he's writing to people who have obeyed the gospel. At the same time, he wants them to know why the gospel is preached to them, why they obey the gospel, and what's going on in their lives. So, I've done a lot of talking. Are there any thoughts, any questions that anybody wants to bring up, any comments that you want to make?
Well, Mark, in verse 28, he talks about if they fail to acknowledge God. They're talking about simply there's no longer respect God as being the authority. And, you know, it's impossible for any man to walk and direct his own steps. And so what happens is God doesn't have to do something to him. He just simply takes his spirit, leaves the person to go their own way, and these things just come natural to them when they leave God.
You know, the idea of this version says that they no longer retain God in their knowledge. They've turned their back on God. You need to understand, we all need to understand, God will never turn his back on you until you turn your back on him. But whenever you do, and you no longer hold him in your knowledge and you turn away from him, then it's easy for him to move on and go a different direction. That doesn't mean that he will never again come to love you. He's not going to forget his love. He's never going to not love you. But when you don't have God in your knowledge, then it's no wonder that people are living the way that they're living.
It's
no wonder.
It's a natural thing that's going to happen when we quit listening to God. All of these things come to us naturally when God leads us.
That's the natural direction of the human. When we push God out, all of these things, as Jerry said, come in to our lives somewhat naturally because that's the nature of mankind. So that's a good point. Jerry?
Well, I guess you call it his catalog or list, kind of, it's not exactly parallel to what he talks about the works of the flesh, but there is a good bit of similarity and overlap over
In Galatians
chapter 5.
Yeah. Perry's comment is that there's not a real correlation and not a real identical list comparing what Paul says in Romans chapter 1 with what he refers to as the works of the flesh when he wrote to the churches of Galatians chapter 5. But they do have an overlap. And again, whenever Paul is writing to the churches of Galatia, he begins to talk about the works of the flesh, fornication and uncleanness and idolatry and sorcery and all the things that are there. They again, going back to how Jerry identified that, they again show the natural direction of man without God in his life. And what a contrast there is between the works of the flesh in Galatians 5 verses 19 to 21 and the word of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5 beginning in verse 22. What a contrast.
One of Jesus' parables, he talks about the evil spirit was removed from somebody, and because nothing took its place, the more evil spirits came back and even worse than ever. And that's the lesson. You've got to replace that evil spirit with something better.
You know, that's right. You know, we've probably experienced that very thing in our own lives. Rex talked about that story that Jesus told about the evil spirit who left. And whenever he left, the vacancies was filled in by more evil spirits who came in because that vacancy was not filled with something good. So Satan is going to find a way to keep those things in your heart and in your mind if you will allow him to, and if you just simply don't replace evil with good. Okay? So, we have not really spent as long as, we've not gone into the detail really that I thought about doing in looking at the Gentile state of sin. But I think hopefully, we've covered that in a good way. Next time, Lord willing, we'll look at what Paul has to say concerning the Jews. It's almost as though, I'll probably say this again, it's almost as though the Jew could be sitting back and saying, yeah, you Gentiles, I told you so. But then he turns his attention to the Jew. He says, don't get too built up and don't get too proud, because the very things that the Gentiles have been guilty of, you Jews are guilty of also. So he's going to turn the table, and we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next time. Thank you for being here, and I hope that the rest of your week goes well. Look forward to seeing you Sunday.
I didn't touch it. I didn't touch it.
You sure?